Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to give you guys an update on my ginger plants. So there's basically two main types of ginger plants I've got. I've got the hardy gingers, which are the Hedychiums. I'm growing them outdoors, although I've got 3 indoors just for overwintering them. And then I've got my tropical ginger, which is just a normal ginger that you would buy in a supermarket, the kind that is edible and you just use for your cooking. So I'll start off with the tropical edible ginger, the one that most people know. This one I've been growing for several years now, and it's actually this very tall, skinny plant on the right hand side here. Now normally ginger plants, especially this type of ginger, would only grow about a metre tall, but this has been in my conservatory and it hasn't been getting the best of light conditions, so as you can see it has grown particularly tall. It's probably about 1.5 meters in height now, so it is quite a large plant, and this plant has been getting bigger and bigger for me every year. So basically I started this from a very small piece of tuber from a supermarket about 3 or 4 years ago. It's then been growing every year. I've not been harvesting any of the tubers, so whenever it goes dormant in winter I dig it up just to check how big the tubers have grown, and then I replant it, and then it's just been getting bigger and bigger every year. It's just a nice foliage plant. If I want to in the future I could maybe start harvesting the tubers, or maybe start using some of the foliage for cooking, but at the moment I'm just growing it more as an ornamental. And I've been hoping it might flower. So far it hasn't had any flowering for the years that I've been growing it, but this year it has actually got the first sign of possible flowering. So I'll show you what that looks like now. So these are the stems at the base of the plant. You can see the 2 at the front. These are the ones that are looking like they're going to be flowering shoots. Now when it comes to the edible ginger, it doesn't tend to grow very tall flowers on the top of a leafy stem. What it often does is it just grows a short stem at the base, and the flowers come straight out of that short stem. So these 2 short stems just down here are growing quite differently to any of the other stems I've had previously, so it's looking hopeful that I might get flowering on this plant this year. It'll be quite nice to get that fragrance from the ginger flowers, and it'll be the first time it has flowered for me, so it'll be interesting to see, as I say. It is now October though, and this normally goes dormant around now, which is actually why the leaves are starting to look so bad. So you can see a lot of browning on some of the leaves. One of the shoots has already died back completely. That's a sign it will go into dormancy soon. It is a tropical plant. It needs about 9 or 10 months of growing season to do well, and as soon as it starts getting cold in my conservatory it tends to go dormant. So what I'm going to do now is leave this in my house in a warmer location so it doesn't go dormant. I'm going to try and encourage flowering this year, and I'll give you guys an update if it does flower. But generally this ginger plant has done much better this year than it has in previous years. It's grown a lot taller, it's had all that energy stored up in its tubers from the previous year, so it can get a good head start, and it's grown a lot more stems than normal. Now they are a little bit leggy, as I say, because of the lack of light, but apart from that it's done quite well. There was some thrip damage, which is some of these little bits you can see in the leaves where it's slightly damaged. The thrips this year weren't too much of an issue. In previous years they've been devastated by thrips, but generally it's done quite well, so I'm quite happy with this ginger plant. It'll be interesting to see if it does flower. So the main part of this video will actually be about my hardy gingers. I'll show them outside in the garden, but I want to show you these 3 inside as well. So these are all Hedychiums. Hedychiums are closely related to the other type of ginger, which is the edible one, but it's in a different genus, so although they're closely related they are quite different. So they look quite similar superficially, especially some of these ones on the left here which have the thinner leaves, but they are much hardier. They can handle cooler climates. Basically most of the Hedychiums come from mountainous areas in the Himalayas. They can handle colder temperatures in winters, and they can even handle some frost, whereas the tropical gingers, they like warm tropical conditions year round, and although they might go dormant into the tubers, they tend to go dormant more because of the dry season rather than a cold season, whereas these Hedychiums experience a little bit of cold climate in the winter time, so they can go dormant underground and survive light frosts, and if you mulch them they can even survive hard frosts. So my idea is to have these growing in the garden. They don't mind my cool summers because they're used to a cooler climate, being in the high altitude mountains, and as long as you keep them well mulched in the winter time, they should overwinter for me outside and do quite well. Now this winter will be the first winter that I've actually grown these, so I'm not too sure how hardy each species is, and I don't want to risk losing them. So what I've done is I've taken 2 of them inside as cuttings, and this 3rd one in the middle is actually a new plant. The reason is because I don't know how hardy they'll be. If I lose all the plants outside, then at least I've got a backup indoors which I can then start again from next year, and I'll just know every year to dig up the tubers and shelter them indoors. If they do survive outside, then I'll just leave them outside every year. Unless we have a very hard winter, they should be fine if they can survive the next winter. I'll just keep them well mulched and hopefully they don't rot off if it gets too damp. So as I say, there's 3 different varieties here. I think my favourite one is this one on the right hand side. This is Hedychium wardii. This Hedychium, or some people call them Hedychiums, I'm not sure the correct pronunciation, but this one, I just think it looks a lot more tropical than the rest. It's got those really large glossy leaves. It also has nice large fragrant yellow flowers that are quite showy and look a bit like an orchid flower, which is quite different to the other gingers. And it just looks a really robust looking plant with nice thick stems. So that's my favourite one so far, and the one outside is doing particularly well. The one on the left, which is looking a bit sorry for itself, that one I got at the same time. They were both very small plants, just a tiny piece of tuber with a bit of dead sticks poking out the top. So they've grown really well this year, especially when I show you the size they've got outdoors. These are just little cuttings that I've removed from the main plant just to keep a small amount indoors. Most of the growth is actually in the plants outside. But this one on the left is Telstar 4. This one is a British grown hybrid Hedychium. It grows about the same height as this on the right. They both grow about 1.5 meters, but it has much thinner leaves, much more slender appearance on the stems. So I don't like this one quite as much. I don't think it looks quite as tropical, but it does actually look more similar to the actual tropical ginger, even though the tropical ginger has smaller leaves and in my opinion looks less tropical. The tropical gingers do tend to have the slightly smaller leaves, or at least the edible version does. So the final plant that I've got recently is this one in the middle here. This Hedychium is called Hedychium gardnerianum. So this one, it should get a lot bigger than the others. This can grow up to about 2.5 meters in height eventually, and it should also have nice looking flowers. The one on the left, the Telstar 4, that has slightly frillier flowers and a bit of a yellowy orange colour. That one did actually flower for me this year. It was actually on that stem there, which is why that main stem is dying back and not looking quite as good. But the gardnerianum one, it should get a lot bigger. The leaves as well should become thicker as it gets older. It should have a similar appearance to the wardii on the right there, with the nice thick glossy leaves. But at the moment, the leaves are quite narrow. It looks more like the Telstar 4. But as it gets older, it should get more of that thicker stem appearance and also the wider leaves. I did notice the first shoots that came up in the beginning of the year from these other two hardy Hedychium gingers, they were quite thin, and then the subsequent shoots that came up after that were much thicker and stronger. So when they are a small clump, they do tend to be quite small like this, but then they kind of get bigger. It takes about a year or something if you've just got an individual piece of tuber for it to start putting out its full size shoots. So this one will be quite interesting to see how it does. This one should be one of the hardiest out of the lot. It also should grow the best. It's invasive in some countries where it's warmer. Here in Scotland it won't be an issue, but in countries which have a warm subtropical climate it can be quite invasive and it can spread very rapidly. So this should do well in my garden. I don't know, I only just got this about a month ago. Since then it's just put up that new shoot. So it's certainly happy in the conservatory where it's nice and warm. You can see the original shoot was just this one here. They shot up that new one just in about a month, so it is growing well for me, but I'll be interested to see how that does in the cooler climate outdoors. But at least I know these other two do grow well in the outside environment here. So I'll take you now to my garden and show you how they've been doing, and they really have done quite well considering how cool the climate is here in North Scotland. So this is the tropical star bed where I've been growing my other Hedychium gingers. So they're quite sheltered. The Hedychiums often, they don't need the direct sunlight, they prefer a bit of dappled shade. They do like bright light conditions though, so not full shade. So they've been doing quite well in this position where they've been a little bit more sheltered. And despite the really strong winds which have damaged my bananas and broken off some of the leaves, the Hedychiums have done quite well. That might be just because they're well sheltered. So I'll take you first of all to the Telstar 4, which is the only one that's shown signs of flowering for me. This one, as I say, is not a particularly tall one. It might get to 1.5 meters if it's really happy. For me, it only seems to be growing to about 1 meter at the moment. But you can see, considering this only had one stem, and that original stem is the one I showed you upstairs, which is why it's dying back, because it's already finished flowering. It has got several stems. The leaves are a lot bigger when it's grown in soil and it's had more space to grow. You can see there is a new flower coming here, although it's the beginning of October at the moment. We'll be getting frost probably in a week or so, so I don't expect this flower to come to anything unless we get an unusual warm spell. But it's growing quite well. You can see the stems as well, much thicker. There's 5 stems here at the moment. There was another 3 or 4 stems, and they actually are now with the cutting that I cut off. I just basically cut it with an old knife and then repotted it, and that would be the one that I keep indoors. This one is the one I'll keep outside, and I'll see how it does. But they certainly do a lot better if you give them out, put them outside, give them the space they need. This one in the future, I might move forward, I'm not sure. But generally what I'm doing with the gingers is they're an understory plant in this tropical bed where I'm going to have things like the tree dahlia here, and also the banana plants. So the idea is the slightly shorter gingers are going to be in the middle of the bed, sheltered by the trees, and then I might put that really tall gardnerianum Hedychium at the back of the border if it does become quite a tall plant. If it can reach the 2.5 meters that it's supposed to. I doubt it'll actually reach that high here in North Scotland, but we'll see how it does. So the other ginger is the wardii here. So this is my favourite one out of the lot. Now when it came to cutting the stems and taking the cutting, I did actually take the larger stem, which is why this one looks a bit smaller than the plant inside. But it's been doing really well. You can see it's looking really lush. It's still growing despite the cooler conditions at the moment. And I've been really happy with how it's bulking up. You can see what I mean by the newer stems are much thicker and stronger than the older stems. So when this first came to me, it was just a dormant tuber, didn't have any growth at all. It then grew this one stem here, which was really small, and I was a bit worried it was going to be a bit of a weak ginger. I did know it had potential for big glossy leaves because I had seen the pictures online, and these leaves, although they're quite short, they were quite wide, so I was hopeful it would get nice and stocky. And then not long after I had it, it probably threw up this shoot here, which you can see is a lot thicker and more robust, a little bit thinner than some of the newest ones, but it's still much more robust than the first. And it started growing this nice shoot up here, which still hasn't flowered yet, but I'm hopeful next year I might get some flowers in these. And then the later stems, because there's been so many stems to give it energy from the sun, photosynthesizing all the leaves, they're much more robust. So this one only came up probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago. See, that's a really nice, thick, robust stem. Around the side here you can see some other ones which are really good, thick, strong stems. So these will hopefully be quite wind resistant. They will be sheltered, so they should be fine. Now, when it comes to Hedychiums, I don't know if they'll flower for me every year. I know here in North Scotland the climate is really not ideal for them. Although they can handle cooler conditions, they do like a warmer summer than what I have here in North Scotland. So I'm hoping these might flower, but I'm not sure. Now the Telstar 4 here, I think the reason this flowered is because I grew it indoors and allowed it to start growing around March time, so it's had a long growing season. That's probably why it's managed to produce one flower this year. Although it was such a small plant, I'm surprised it produced any flowers. So what I'll do next year is I'll see how they do from established plants in the ground. If they flower, that's a bonus, but the main thing I'm growing these for is actually the foliage, just for that nice tropical appearance. And the ones that I've kept as cuttings from these indoors, they'll get a head start next spring in the conservatory. And if they come to flower and these don't, what I might do in the future is, even if these are hardy in the ground, is dig them up every year just to give them a head start in spring, just to encourage them to flower. So that's about it for this video with the hardy gingers. As I say, no flowers yet on the wardii. I've had flowers in the Telstar, and hopefully I'm going to have flowers in the edible ginger soon. So I'll give you guys an update when the edible ginger starts flowering, and hopefully next spring when these other gingers start coming up, if they've survived the winter.